So welcome to the final part of this segment. Now, what we're going to do is basically pick our favorite comps, align that with the original reference source, and let's go on to draw a final comp based on kind of what we learned and what we practiced prior. So I went ahead and did that. I'm not doing or performing anything new whatsoever, so I went and did that off camera, and that's kind of what my drawing looks like. And just to kind of break that down a little bit for you guys to explain what I did and perhaps why I did it, yeah, let me show you. So I went with something kind of like the lower one here, right, where I have a lower horizon. I just like the simple setup of that. It's like essentially this kind of shape where I have a lot of this pointing there. I have right a prominent focal point right here, and I'm trying to use a lot of the smaller shapes to drive direction to and from, building up that focal point. I always like the trees kind of framing that, so I incorporated that element around a good amount of them as well. They're also great for a sense of scale, so I do have a couple trees that I add into the background really far there. So, I mean, ultimately, if I rotate the original reference like this, not a lot has changed. I kind of moved some trees around, I recomposed the background, I changed this. I'm going to add a lot more snow to the background too for additional flavor. But, by and far, it's pretty similar. But again, it's my take, my interpretation on this. And again, once you have your lines and your directional flow kind of working throughout your scene, maybe it might be a good idea this week to try to evaluate how your form, of action is working. So in my case, if I trace some of the forms in the beginning, right, they're kind of doing something like this, or they're coming around, it's kind of pinching in a little bit here, and it's kind of widening out and getting pretty wide to basically sandwich my form of the main subject matter itself, the house. And then of course we have the trees. They're adding a little bit of verticality to the image, and again sandwiching in that form as well. Now, taking a closer look into the background, what I ultimately have going on back here is something fairly similar. There's basically a giant wedge shape up over the background, and I do have a couple different versions of that where it's like basically the form is kind of coming up like a large soft foamy element like that. It's going down and then dipping up and around, and that land mass, right, that's all adding and directing to the viewer as well, in addition to the shapes. On top of that, though, right, the mountains aren't doing too much to that. They're mostly like a vertical structure, but they're a little bit flatter, and it's adding in a different, in terms of the verticality, it's just doing something a bit more like that. But it's a nice kind of flow and rhythm, I find, to just bring that viewer's eye, to that. And this mountain, right, it's kind of doing something like that. Or, in some cases, it's even doing this. So that's what the form of action. Of course, the water is absolutely flat, and the individual shapes of the logs, they're not doing much, but they're adding just a little bit of variety of that as well. So again, two modes of thinking, right? Lines, shapes, and then of course forms. All these basic art and design principles in a play underneath our structural drawing. So again, once you have a bit of a final sketch, go on and let's bring it up to a presentable level of finish. That will vary, of course, from person to person and art to artist. And I want to talk about some of the techniques that I've done to do that. For me, I always start with the sky value. In this, it's kind of a lighter to neutral, so I just fill that in. And what I want to talk about is some of the specific techniques that I'm using to do that. The first thing would be clipping masks, and I'll get into that in a moment. So this is the first kind of layer I have. As you can see in the lower area here, it is just that, essentially the background on top of the sky with a gradient set for the water. You can do the water on the same layer, or you can do it separately. But basically, the idea of clipping masks keeps everything fairly tidy throughout the process. So let's say like the next major shape in this composition, for example, would be the house. So if I want to add the house, right, I'm toggling my drawing layer on and off so I can match it. All right, so essentially it kind of looks like that. But see, it's all one shape. So let's say if I want to paint in grass or rocks to that shape, what I can do is make a new layer, and if I hold Alt in between the two of them, you'll see it will add a little arrow to the side of it, and it will basically group it to it. So that means, specifically for this, right, if I add, what's it called? If I lock the pixels, then I can go on and, let's just say, paint in, within that shape. And it works, pretty good for that. Or, I can lock it all together, and no matter what I do, see, it just stays within that grouping, which is a great way to retain edges and get a lot of mileage fairly quickly. So see, since I have a few major layers distinguished, what I can do now is go behind the layer. So if I want to go back and add some snow behind that, right, I can do that. And I can make sure the snow is going to stay within the mountain shape by keeping it clipped to the mountain shape below that. And so remember, this is all about just designing and refining beautiful, nice shapes. And I got that snow through a few different ways. I was making, let me hide that for a second. I was making various types of dynamic, selections. And even within that selections, I was going in with my brushwork, and I was trying to add nice brush movement, within that. But let's say this is what you're going to get. Now we're going to talk about edge control momentarily. See, like, that's a very digital looking edge, which is all right in some styles and in some situations. But if you want to basically increase a little bit of the edge fluidity a little bit, what I generally do is I'm using a smudge tool. See, it's the hand in Photoshop, and I can push and pull some of these pixels if I want to change it. Now, I don't want something obviously too janky looking like that, or in a way obvious that I even did this, but it's a nice subtle way to kind of soften some of these edges, see, like this, and just make it feel a little bit more natural. I can also come in with a brush and just erase some of that as well, which gets rid of that I just used the lasso tool sort of look to it. So again, I played that around. The other thing you can do to get really nice shapes, perhaps ones that you didn't invent before, is I select the basic shape that I made, and I do transform. You can skew and you can warp. You can do a variety of things to this. So see, it kind of can make, you can kind of make a new shape based on that, and maybe this isn't a shape you would have drawn by hand. Right, so something like that. Now imagine if I copy and paste this, right, get the same thing. I can even add different effects to this. Like, let's try the skew tool. What does that do? Well, it'll add a lot more of an angle to things. So it's another great way to take a single mark that you make and get a lot of mileage out of that. Again, it saves time, and it helps you create shapes and movements that you didn't make before, prior. So again, you can experiment with erasing into something kind of like that, and just kind of go at it to your heart's content. So again, doing that technique, I ended up with something kind of like this, which again fits the original sketch, and it supplements the direction that I want to push the viewer's eye around in this shot. So yeah, edge control, that is something to be mindful of and to manage, and it can help the how things look pretty well. So let me again show that again. Here's a square, right? And if I fill that with the square, this is done with using selections, which I love using selections. But as you can see, that's perfect, right? Practically perfect in every way with the edges. Let me zoom in here. What I like to do is something a bit more of a painted edge, which can look something more like this, right? Where if I'm going to make an edge right like this, see, it's not quite as crisp and perfect. And if I pick the background color and erase on that side, it's a great way to kind of manage the brushwork. Now, if you're sloppy with this, generally what you see is a lot of ghosting effect that happens in like a digital software. See, like where the edge, I'm painting that, and it looks something kind of like that. That, I would say, is not a great edge. But if I kind of clean that up, you know, it can look a lot better. So this is, for me, personally, this is kind of what makes the most natural looking edge, the most kind of hand-painted edge, you know, out of the lot here. So see, just kind of building that up, it makes for a nice natural edge. Where if I did that with a selection, it's going to look quite different. Now the other, you know, on the other end of the spectrum in regards to edges is something that's completely lost, or in this case soft, right? And this is the case where you're using too much of an airbrush. So see, it's going to look something like that, and even kind of painting like that and getting it smaller, see, it's still going to always have a very soft and fuzzy looking edge. So you have to decide, what edges do you want to be super crisp, what do you want to kind of be looking fairly normal, and what do you want to be softer, right? And that's all by design. Like you wanted to figure out what works best for the right occasion. So see, I would want something more natural or even crisp when it comes to these foreground elements, because they're in focus. But as you can see, I softened up a little bit of that background to be a little out of focus. Your eye, think of how you're gonna look at the natural world. If you're gonna look, you know, pretty far into the distance, you're not gonna see something absolutely crisp like that in terms of edges. And I tried to bring that forward to some of the smaller elements as well. And for me, once I have these basic elements kind of working, it's just a matter of coming in, you know, and adding in the remainder elements. So do I need reflections? Do I need a little bit of brushwork to break up the you know, the gradients that I was using? Do I want to add, you know, detail to that house? And this is the idea of breaking the elements in my scene down into their local values. And what I mean by that is, if let me come back up to this, right? If I grab a line tool, right, like the house, the roof, the grass, and the rock, basically anything in the scene, I'm having it be its own starting value. See, like on the spectrum of light and dark. So for me, I'm just starting the trees, right, as being the darkest element. I'm having that the house be a lighter gray, the roof be, right, a little bit darker than that. The rocks in the scene, they're going to be about that light, and the grass is a little darker than the rocks. So see, they all have their starting point. And that's one of the major mistakes a beginner artist will make, is that they'll start them all very much in gray form, you know, like this. If I hide that, a beginner may do, and they'll just take everything, you know, kind of like this, and then like this. Let's even include the chimney in this example. Right, and they're going to take that, and they're going to shade it all just lighter. It's like, oh, this is where the light is happening. You know, maybe maybe there's like an overhang visibly present like that for the roof. And of course, let's even include, right, the grass, you know, into that equation as well. Right, so the grass is going to look like this. And since the grass is round, where we have a form shadow happening on the grass, it's going to be softer, right? So that's going to look something kind of like this, where it's soft, right? It's going around the hill. But see, the problem with this is, even though we could see what's in light and what's in shadow, it's basically implying that the grass, the house, the roof, the chimney, all these elements are the same value. And that's just not the case. I think a great way to actually show this would be using some color and some value with some actual different objects. So see, like this is the lightest object in the scene. The oranges are pretty light to medium. The bowl here is dark. And we're going to get more specifically into this down the road, but this is just kind of the basics. If I take this and desaturate it, see, that's light, that's dark, that's medium, And of course that's medium with a lot of contrast as well. So every object has its own starting point, and then the lighting is applied to that starting point. And again, this is a lesson we're going to certainly cover the following week, but that's the idea, and it's something to keep in mind as you're trying to make your compositions flow a little bit better and look even a little bit better in this earlier weeks. The other thing that you can really start to play with is texture in a scenes. There's a lot of ways to do texture, right? Sometimes it's, and this is something that'll be going, ongoing as well in the future. So here's kind of like my finished project. I did brushwork, for example, on the logs. The grass is pretty soft but implied. But let's say if I wanted to add, like a little texture in there, there's a way to do it. You can grab a brush. You can do it, manually. There's a lot of ways to do it. The thing is, I want to keep it within the relatively the same value family. So see, if I go too much brighter than that, it's going to start to change how that whole value is perceived, and that's kind of what I want to avoid. But if light is coming and hitting the cusp of this cliff here, yeah, I want that to be a little lighter, and obviously, right, like that, a little bit darker in the shadow region. But I want to keep the texture of them, like the rocks and the grass and the roof, all kind of contained within their shape, and it helps for that increased readability. Now, at the same time, if I use a brush, like the grass brush or the rock brush or the leaf brush, if I make it obvious that I'm using something like that, like, okay, here's my grass, and you just fill it all, right, with this same brush like this, it's gonna be very obvious that you did that, and it's gonna look gimmicky and a little bit hokey as a result. You gotta, again, vary up your brush strokes, vary up your actual brushes, switch and change them around, and kind of just have your techniques blend together. So see, I don't even like a lot of that because it looks like I used a very similar brush, even though I actually don't mind that too much. It pays to kind of just come in and do things a little bit by hand to keep the variety of that brush work, working pretty well. Either way, if you zoom out, if it's not too offensive that it looks like you stamped one thing the entire time, then that's usually fine. So do your best to get your image looking presentable in value, or if you want to jump to color, go to color. I'm just going to show these demonstrations in value for those that are absolutely have no idea in color. If I demonstrated in color, you would be even more lost. So I'm going to keep it simple just like this. So right there's edge control, there's attention to the local value of individual objects. There we use clipper mask, we build up layers. Like, I didn't add a lot of the subtle lighting, like the smoke and things, till the very end. I balanced out the adding atmosphere. So I think special effects kind of toward the end, after you've blocked out your foundation. For me personally, that just works the best. Again, feel free to experiment if you desire. So do your best this week. Bring up your best studies, and then try to refine and build a composition that's based off all of that, of course. Next week, we'll be talking more specifically about the properties of light, how we can construct value structures from them, and we'll go from there.